Hello and welcome back. I'm going to give you a little overview now of what we're going to be covering in this talk. As you can see, I've divided my talk into three parts of somewhat unequal length. I'm going to start with a brief definition of what academic language or academic usage actually is, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about academic vocabulary or academic lexis. There are two main reasons for this. First, we know very little about academic lexis and general academic lexis in particular. Second, if we analyze errors in translated texts, we'll notice that around 60 to 70% of these are lexical errors, and many of these lexical errors concern the general language or subtechnical academic words, that is, words that occur in several disciplines. Interestingly, translators of academic texts are usually not aware of this problem, as I found when I did an informal survey among practicing translators. So this is why I'm going to focus on lexis today. Still, I'm not going to neglect syntax altogether, but I'm going to concentrate on just one area, the positioning and redistribution of adverbials or adjuncts. Most of you will be intuitively familiar with this translation difficulty. German sentences sometimes appear to be filled to bursting with adverbials, and it's usually impossible to pack all of those adverbs into just one English sentence. So this is one problem we're going to look at in part 3. A brief word about methodology. I've already hinted that I don't make up my examples out of thin air. Rather, I've culled them from translated texts, either published translations or translations that I've post-edited. My revisions of these translations and any other type of evidence I'll be using are all based on large corpora of academic English and academic German, so that they may be regarded as reliable accounts of current academic usage. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started by asking ourselves, what is academic usage? Well, academic usage, we might say, is the way in which academics use language, or as Ken Hyland puts it, the subset of lexicogrammatical features and rhetorical conventions which have evolved to perform certain valued functions for those who use them. Well, that may sound a little highfalutin. It does reveal an undeniable truth about academic language. It takes years to master, and academics tend to put a lot of effort into writing about their specialisms. Now, this uncomfortable truth allows us to see the two great stumbling blocks that aspiring academic translators need to overcome. The first is that native speakerhood in and of itself doesn't qualify them to write about science. And second, university training qualifies them to write about one or two specialisms, but not necessarily about others. And this shows us that it's really a Herculean task to make a usage-compliant translation of an academic text. So let's have a look at the key features of academic texts. What I've done here is I've transformed a non-specialist into a specialist academic text, and I've highlighted some of the bits of text that have been transformed. A first point to note is that verbal formulations are turned into nominalizations, including compounds. So the text starts with der Anteil der Eltern steigt, die von der Schule erwarten, and in the academic text and the more specialist text, this becomes die vermehrten elterlichen Erwartungen hinsichtlich der Fähigkeit von Schule. A second point is that subordinate clauses become relational verbs. So if we look at the other sentence that's highlighted in turquoise here, dass sich die Chancen der Kinder vermindern, scheint viele Eltern nicht genug zu bekümmern. This becomes die Verminderung der Chancen resultiert aus, or we could also say, entsteht durch fehlende elterliche Sensibilität. Note also that we've used, in the final version, we've used a Bildungssprachliches, we say in German, bildungssprachliches word, a learned word, resultieren rather than entstehen, because these words are preferred in specialist academic text. Another point is that nouns or other items are turned into classifying and compound adjectives. So Eltern becomes elterlich, ganz allein becomes institutionsintern, another learned word, Latinate word. And a final point is that simple forms become complex forms very often, so that Chancen is made more precise by saying Bildungschancen. So let's move on to academic lexis, or academic vocabulary. Academic vocabulary forms a continuum. At one end, there's ordinary general vocabulary such as with, house, knife, etc. Some of which has specific academic uses. For instance, the word find is often used in the phrase "it is found that," or the word show is often used in the construction something can be shown to be something. At the other end, there is subject-specific terminology and phraseology such as gravity in physics, or dwelling unit in geography and economics, or gender difference in sociology, or pictorial space in the fine arts. And in between, we find learned words, which I've already mentioned, aptly described as Bildungssprache in German, that is the language accessible only to the educated, and these are words like commensurate, accrete, or sukzessive in German, but also successive in English, and the two are false friends, by the way. Then there's general academic vocabulary that is common to most or all academic disciplines, words like system, premise, presuppose, or Gegenstand, and subtechnical vocabulary that is specific to just one or more disciplines. So for instance, societal in the social sciences, or grave goods in history and archaeology. We're now going to look at some examples of typical translation problems that are associated with each of these vocabulary areas. Let's start with a seemingly harmless German noun, the noun Überlegung. In everyday German, the word typically teams up with partners such as nach reiflicher Überlegung, bin ich zu dem Schluss gekommen, dass es eine Überlegung wert, es gibt bereits konkrete Überlegungen zu etwas, oder solche Überlegungen haben dabei keine Rolle gespielt. In academic parlance, Überlegung is more commonly combined with classifying adjectives, so we get theoretische Überlegung, methodische Überlegung, konzeptionelle Überlegung. And we also find combinations with deictic adjectives, such as die nachfolgende Überlegung or bisherige Überlegung. The main verbs shared by the two registers, so common speech and academic parlance, are anstellen and basieren. So Überlegung anstellen, Überlegung basieren auf etwas. But in common speech, there's hardly any evidence of einbeziehen, Überlegung einbeziehen, einfließen lassen, or of stehen, stellen, or münden. So, grammatically speaking, there's a clear predilection for plural uses of the word in academic German. The first sense of Überlegung given in the Duden is the act of thinking, das Überlegen, as we can see here. But this sense is almost non-existent in academic text. Rather, the noun is predominantly used to denote thoughts or ideas. The Duden defines this as its second sense, Folge von Gedanken, durch die sich jemand vor einer Entscheidung oder Ähnliches über etwas klar zu werden versucht. But clearly its use in academic text doesn't necessarily presuppose stock-taking before a decision, and it sort of straddles the boundary between the two meanings given in the Duden, as we'll see in a moment. And so let's look at this example of a problematic translation of Überlegung. The German text says, ist die Einteilung der Welt in Gegenstandsbereiche wirklich mehr als eine Façon de parler? Dieser Einwand könnte sich auf die folgende Überlegung stützen. Viele Gegenstände, vielleicht sogar alle, sind aus anderen Gegenständen zusammengesetzt. And the translator has rendered Überlegung by reflection. This objection could be supported by the following reflection. Now, to find out whether this is an adequate rendition of Überlegung in this context, we need to do a corpus search. What we find is that these days reflection tends to be used in its singular form as an uncountable noun, meaning careful thought. So typical collocations are prompt further reflection or invite reflection. Its plural use is common in collocations such as offer one's reflections on something. And usage wavers occasionally in the case of collocations like inspire reflection or inspire reflections with little difference in meaning. So the translator's rendition turns out to be wrong. It could have been used in the 19th century. We find this use in Coleridge, for instance, but it's no longer appropriate today. So now we've established that reflection is an inadequate rendition of Überlegung in the case under discussion. The next step, of course, is to find a more adequate one. This table shows how different academic uses of Überlegung shade off into each other by almost imperceptible gradations. From the sharply defined Überlegung münden, which does imply decision making, as implied in the first Duden definition, by a borderline case, etwas durch eine Überlegung gewinnen, all the way to purely phraseological uses. So let's look at these one by one. First, use of Überlegung illustrates Duden Sense 2, as we've already said. It implies decision making. Die Überlegung zur Vielfalt der dabei zu berücksichtigen Aspekte münden in eine Erweiterung des Kriterienkatalogs von Henne Rehbock 1979. Now, adequate English renditions here would be discussion, analysis, exploration, examination, consideration, or investigation of the various aspects involved will enable us to extend the set of criteria developed by Henne Rehbock. So we're using quite general academic words here, which are typical of academic text when describing analysis or discussion. The second sense is slightly different, and it's not covered by the Duden definitions, or rather it's neither sense 1 nor sense 2. It could be defined as the result of an act of thinking, so the result of definition A, or an opinion obtained by reflection. Biancanini, ein Schüler von Clavius, ermittelte 120 Fuß, Mersenne 96 Fuß und Forrest 70 Fuß. Letzterer hatte diesen Abstand durch folgende Überlegung gewonnen. Er ging davon aus, dass eine Silbe eine Länge von 210 Fuß einnehme. Here, of course, we can't use discussion to render Überlegung. We have to use something like idea or consideration. The idea behind the latter's calculation was as follows. Or in arriving at this distance, he'd been guided by the following consideration. Or his calculation of the distance was based on the following consideration or the following idea. The next sentence, diese Überlegungen seien an einigen Beispielen verdeutlicht, shows the same sense pluralized and generalized. So it's still the result of an act of thinking, but in a more general sense. And here English often uses the very general noun point, something that has been said. A few examples will illustrate these points. In the next sentence, this very same sense has been generalized further. Für die folgende Überlegung wird davon ausgegangen, dass, and here we could use discussion again in English, and the final sentence illustrates a use of Überlegung that is almost empty of meaning. Diese Überlegungen gelten auch für die Reifephase. This is simply a phraseological expression that allows us to move from one paragraph or one bit of text to another. So we get typical renditions like the same is true of, the same considerations hold true for, and so on. So what we've just seen is that dictionaries are usually inadequate when it comes to describing the highly polysemous uses of general language nouns in academic text. What I've done here is I've compiled a little skill box that will help you analyze the meaning of such general language nouns when you encounter them in academic text. As I was saying, you can't rely on dictionaries, so you have to do your own corpus-based analyses. With predicative nouns, that is, nouns that have complementation patterns, you should do an analysis of these complementation patterns and also look at adjectival and verbal collocates. And on that basis, you can create a cognitive profile of the noun's meaning from typical collocates. It may also be useful to contrast the noun with a synonym to tease out its meaning using a tool such as Sketch Engine's sketch difference. Here's an example with collocates of the German noun Mangel appearing in green and those of its synonym Schwäche appearing in red. And even from such a limited comparison, it's evident that Mangel can be more easily combined with concrete real-world entities. So we have hygienischer Mangel, ein Mangel beheben, ein Mangel beseitigen, while Schwäche is the preferred term to discuss the shortcomings of abstract entities. So konzeptionelle Schwäche, institutionelle Schwäche, militärische Schwäche. With non-predicative nouns, so these are nouns that do not govern any complements, you need to include the wider context. So with a noun like Nischendasein, for instance, you need to include verbs where Nischendasein is the accusative or dative object, and these verbs betray the negative semantic prosody of the noun. We talk of jemanden in ein Nischendasein drängen or verdammen, so it's not something you do off your own accord. You don't choose a Nischendasein. And also it shows that attempts are usually made to escape from a Nischendasein, sich aus einem Nischendasein befreien, herausführen. Again, this shows us that the Duden definition of Nischendasein, for example, Dasein, Existenz in einem kleinen überschaubaren Lebensraum, doesn't capture the pejorative overtones of Nischendasein in actual use. Let's move on to another class of general language words, words like etwa, eben, ja, gerade, or schon. Technically, these are known as tonal particles, and they give both German speech and German writing its distinctive flavor. These words have subtleties of usage that make them extremely difficult to acquire for foreign learners of German, and even experienced translators often misconstrue them. Unlike other translation units, these particles can't be rendered by straightforward functional equivalence. Let's look at the example which contains the particle ja. Diese Zeremonie ist an Einzelheiten sehr reich. Für unsere Aufzählung, der es ja nur um Formationen geht, ist ein Haufen am Boden zu erwähnen, der sich aus allen Männern zusammenbildet. This ceremony is very rich in details. but as we are here only concerned with groupings, I shall single out the heap on the ground formed by all the men together. Now, strictly speaking, the German particle ja and the English conjunction as are not functionally equivalent. Ja suggests that the proposition made is based on given information that is shared by the author and the reader, while as simply has a chiefly causal meaning. So if we oversimplify somewhat, we might say that ja has no meaning at all. It must be read as a metalinguistic instruction to the reader as to the informational status of the prepositional phrase. So what we're saying really is, as you know, I've already pointed out that our listing confines itself to groupings. So there's no functional equivalence between the two marker words, although the rendition of ja by as is intuitively satisfactory. Now, a similar example is geradezu, which has clearly been misapprehended by the translator of the following excerpt. Jene Erbfolgekriege, die geradezu als eine Art Strukturelement des Zeitalters des Barock und der Aufklärung interpretiert worden sind. The Wars of Succession, this is the published translation, the Wars of Succession, which were widely viewed as a structural element of the 17th and 18th centuries. My suggestion, the Wars of Succession, which came to be viewed as something approaching a structural feature of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, geradezu is not used to make claims about the real world, such as how widely something was applied. Rather, it legitimates the use of a word that might otherwise seem inappropriate. So we will need to find English equivalents that serve the same metalinguistic function, and a phrase that springs to mind is something like, or more formally, something approaching. Now, if you think this is a one-off problem, you'd be wrong. 90% of the uses of geradezu in my parallel corpus are mistranslated, and the same goes for a number of other particles. So particles are a serious problem that needs to be given more thought and attention. Let's turn to learned words, or Bildungssprache. As you're probably keenly aware, both English and German, but German in particular, have a rich stock of words that remain completely opaque to the rank and file of language users. Examples are sukzessive, exemplarisch, aktualisieren, mutatis mutandis, cum grano salis in German, or accrete, oeuvre, apax, qua in English. These words and phrases are more or less direct borrowings from Latin, Greek, French, and they're acquired mainly through secondary and higher education. In Germany, their use has been encouraged through a tacit convention that they're markers of erudite cosmopolitanism. The famous post-war philosopher Theodor Adorno went so far as to describe them as little cells of resistance to nationalist and purist tendencies. In English-speaking countries, overuse of learned words is frowned upon, though, as being undemocratic or pompous. It's said to compromise the principles of clarity, precision, and academic modesty that are the mainstay of English academic writing. Now, the implication is, of course, that not every German Bildungswort needs to be translated as a learned word into English. Let's look at an example that is doubly problematic in this sense because it attempts to translate Bildungssprache by Bildungssprache, and it picks a word that is not equivalent to the German word. The original reads, Dies zwingt uns dazu, die Frage nach der Intelligence of the Emotions gerade für die motivationalen Gemengelagen des Wirtschaftssystems endlich nachdrücklicher zu stellen. And the translator has rendered this by, this forces us to finally pose the question about the intelligence of the emotions with greater vigor, but focused more emphatically on the motivational melange of the economic system. My revision of this is, this forces us to finally pose the question of the intelligence of the emotions with greater vigor, especially regarding the economic system, where such diverse and often conflicting motivations are at play. Now, clearly the translator has not given enough thought to the meaning of Gemengelage. Probably he relied exclusively on a bilingual dictionary or translation memory. However, minimal requirement in such cases would be to consult a monolingual dictionary. The Duden has this to say on Gemengelage: Zusammentreffen von sonst eher unzusammenhängenden Zuständen, Gegebenheiten. And Wikipedia, which you might also want to consult on this point, adds, das Wort wird auch im allgemeinen Sprachgebrauch für eine unübersichtliche Situation verwendet, etwa für widersprüchliche Interessen unterschiedlicher Akteure. Now, Corpus Search confirms the Wikipedia definition. It reveals that Gemengelage is usually described as kompliziert, gefährlich, or even explosiv. And this helps us understand what is meant by motivationale Gemengelage. It's about the diverse interests and motivations of economic actors, so that an acceptable solution might be circumstances where diverse and often conflicting motivations are at play, or something along those lines. A mélange, by contrast, is a mixture, usually of an incongruous or eclectic nature. It's often used by food, art, or literary critics to describe the blending of literal and metaphorical ingredients in a concrete or abstract entity. So a mélange describes an entity. Compare this to Gemengelage, which is used with reference to situations or circumstances. So the two words describe entirely different ontological classes. Adjectives typically associated with mélange include confusing, puzzling, messy, and interesting. Here's an example. Characteristic of Dickinson's pointed and always effective wordplay, this mélange of negatives becomes one of her riddle poems. Note that Gemengelage is followed by a genitivus subjectivus, which, even if mélange were an apt choice, this genitivus subjectivus couldn't be rendered by of. That's because it's whatever you mix that completes the of phrase with mélange, a mélange of fact and fiction, a mélange of styles, a mélange of blues and jazz. So that the defective translation would suggest that elements of the system are being recombined and that the mix obtained motivates people, and absurd as this may seem, the example illustrates a slight tendency among academic translators to devise solutions that are superficially clever and sound learned, have an academic ring to them, but actually make no sense whatsoever. This allows me to segue into the next example, which makes a similar point about a general academic vocabulary item. When it comes to general language items, translators are often lulled into a false sense of security because of the apparent simplicity of these words. Like monolinguals, who may misinterpret a word for years until they realize its true meaning, translators may think they've understood a word that they encounter regularly, when in fact they haven't. And this is the case, for instance, with the German word Gegenstand or Forschungsgegenstand, which is often mistranslated as object of research. Most of the time, though, Forschungsgegenstand can be translated by verbs like investigate or study, or by nouns such as subject matter, area of intellectual inquiry, focus, research problem, and countless other more natural renditions than object of research. Now, the example I'd like to look at is a special case of general language item, a German particle verb. German particle verbs and the nouns derived from them in particular offer great scope for expressing research acts in terms of physical motions. Examples of these verbs are aufdecken, herangehen, sich befassen mit, verfolgen, anfügen, einbegreifen, hervorheben, unterstellen, abgrenzen, heranziehen, aufweisen, and sich zuwenden. Now, these verbs are formed by adding a prefix to a simple verb such as ziehen, and this allows the meaning of these verbs to be especially qualified and made dynamic, heranziehen, hinzuziehen, and so on. Our example contains the verb ausdifferenzieren, so a verb that combines a learned root with a native prefix. Dieses Hauptziel wird durch weitere Ziele ausdifferenziert und durch eine Serie modellartiger Evidenzen umgesetzt. The translator has rendered this as, this main goal is differentiated by other objectives and implemented by a series of model-like equivalences. There is a pattern of differentiate in English which resembles the one the translator has opted for, but it does so grammatically rather than semantically. In a typical English pattern like care work is differentiated by gender, what is differentiated in the English pattern, so the object, is real-world entities rather than goals or ideas. And what they're differentiated by is some statistical variable or factor, gender in this case. By metaphorical extension, any kind of area or sphere, such as a research tradition, may be differentiated by a particular feature, such as their choice of explanatory mechanisms. Goals and objectives, however, are neither real-world entities nor areas, nor do they belong to different ontological categories. The German sentence simply means there's a main goal and there are several sub-goals. So the sub-goals are not characterized by the main goals, but rather subsumed under them. To subsume is the correct choice here. So the correct version reads, this main goal, which subsumes other, more detailed objectives, will be implemented using various bodies of evidence that have the quality of models. Let's move on to subtechnical lexis. Subtechnical lexis or vocabulary can be distinguished on the one hand from the general academic lexis that carries the main burden of any kind of academic communication, and on the other hand, from subject-specific terminology. Put another way, the distinction is between the universal language of learned inquiry and the special language of particular disciplines. A discipline like history, for example, has a vocabulary all of its own for describing historical periods and events. Mittelalter, Wilhelminisch, for example, or for describing disciplinary specialisms, geschlechtergeschichtlich, kulturgeschichtlich, zivilisationsgeschichtlich, and also for describing procedures, Quelleninterpretation, for example. But history shares words such as emendation, redaction, or narrative with literary criticism, participatory, secularization, and commune with sociology, or socioeconomic, revenue and scarcity with economics. So this is subtechnical lexis. Though it's theoretically separate from subject-specific terminology, subtechnical vocabulary requires the same kinds of translation procedures and causes the same types of errors. So here's a small specimen of a characteristic type of error. Damit läge in Deutschland noch heute eine Rezeptionshaltung vor, wie sie Bestand hatte, als die deutschsprachige Literatur des damaligen Südwestafrika unter die deutsche Literatur subsumiert wurde. The translator has rendered this by, it seems therefore that the attitude cultivated towards the reception of such literature has remained unchanged since the German language literature of the former colony of Southwest Africa was subsumed into German literature. Now the problem here is not so much lexicosemantic as interpretive. German Rezeptionshaltung harks back to reception theory, of course, which was developed by Jauss and Iser in the 1960s and 1970s. Rezeptionshaltung can be paraphrased as Haltung, die der Leser gegenüber dem Text einnimmt. The English translator, however, has misunderstood the compound as meaning Haltung, die man gegenüber der Rezeption von Texten einnimmt. So the Rezeptionshaltung which the text alludes to is the view that Southwest African literature written in German is German literature rather than an independent type of literature. The revised version uses a verbal formulation involving a clause introduced by way, similar to a WH clause, and this version recognizes that despite the widespread use of noun reception in English, the verb receive is somewhat ambiguous and should be replaced by verbs such as read, discuss, or treat. Now, if intuition fails, a list of collocates can be generated using the Google Books corpus, for instance, by entering something like literature is V standing for verb, of course. It seems, therefore, that the ways in which such literature is read and discussed have remained unchanged. Now let's turn briefly to an area you know well, terminology. My take on terminology is that much of the literature and terminology has made things over complex, and that well-established linguistic concepts from traditional and frame semantics provide perfectly adequate assistance for academic translators. So I'd argue that it's unnecessary for translators to represent interrelationships between terminological items by means of complex networks, or as has been suggested in the literature. Instead, I'd suggest using what I call the principle of least effort. Translators need to identify and analyze terminology to the extent that such analysis is useful to the task at hand, but no further. In so doing, they have greater freedom when dealing with provisional terms that are found in position papers, perhaps, and in theses, and these can usually be paraphrased in the target language. But the reverse is true of definitive terms, which may still require tedious and time-consuming researches. Now, one of the most common failures in dealing with terminology is not to be able to recognize it as being terminology in the first place. The reason may be that much terminology in the humanities and the social sciences is indistinguishable from general language vocabulary, and indeed often derives from general language uses. So it's advisable to err on the safe side by assuming that almost any word could be terminological in nature, especially any noun. The noun Bildraum, as used in the following text, is a case in point. Eine nie gesehene Dramatik erfüllte bei Audubon den Bildraum, mit der die Ornithologie ihre Herkunft aus dem besinnlichen Geist protestantischer Pfarrhäuser abstreifte und in das Abenteuergenre überwechselte. And the translation reads, in addition to the remarkable format and spectrum of colors, the book offered illustrations of an entirely new type. With Audubon, ornithology abandoned the contemplative spirit of Protestant parsonages in which it was born and entered a new adventurer's life. The sentence eine nie gesehene Dramatik erfüllte den Bildraum must be read as a statement about the artistic composition of the picture. It's not a statement, as the translation appears to suggest, about the content of the book and the new style of illustration it exemplifies. The fact that Bildraum is a technical term can be ascertained from a brief look at Google Books, where we find books with titles such as Der Bildraum in der Landschaftsmalerei. And of course, there are also numerous examples of the word being used in the visual arts. Now, in accordance with the principle of least effort, an experienced translator who is conversant with the rules of word formation could resort to intelligent guessing and conduct a search for pictorial space, picture space, visual space, or similar conjectures on Google Books, preferably in combination with terms such as painting, painter, composition, and so on. Now, this returns a number of hits. I've reproduced one here. For picture space and pictorial space from native speaker writings dealing with painting and art history. Now, it's important to to enter picture space in inverted commas here and to add words like painter, painting, composition, because otherwise you'll also get results from books about photography, for example. A more laborious but systematic way of getting at the same information is by consulting a term bank, such as the Art and Architecture Thesaurus Online. Pictorial space can here be found as a child of space, which is itself a child of form and composition concepts. The entry records Chinese, Spanish, and Dutch equivalents, and BabelNet provides a link to the Wikipedia entry for the Spanish equivalent Espacio Pictórico. The next step involves checking whether the collocation in Bildraum erfüllen can be translated literally. And here too, a Google book search will do the trick. We find this, for example, in a book by Anna Swinburne, Marching Bands and Masked Revelers Fill the Pictorial Space. Finally, the subject-noun phrase eine nie gesehene Dramatik needs to be transposed in such a way as to accord with the choice of collocation. Drama itself is too abstract to serve as subject, but scenes of something abstract can fill both pictures and pages. So my suggestion would be scenes of unprecedented drama fill the pictorial space.
This is the last slide on lexis, and actually combines lexis with syntax by resorting to the notion of construction. As you may know, there are two competing models of how language works. One is called the slot filler or dictionary cum grammar model, and there's also the constructional model. According to the slot filler model, which is also known as generative grammar, language use consists in filling sentence slots with words, and we retrieve these words either from a mental word store or from a printed dictionary. And this allows us to be almost infinitely creative, generative. That's why it's called generative grammar. The only limitation is that sentences must be grammatical. The other model is construction grammar, and this model assumes that linguistic creativity is severely restricted by the forces of usage and analogy. The great claim of this relatively recent approach to linguistic theory is that our knowledge of language is based on a network of form-meaning pairs, a constructicon, rather than a lexicon consisting of words, word senses, and word combinations on the one hand, and a grammar consisting of syntactic structures on the other. Let's look at one such construction and why it's important to view it as a construction rather than as a free combination of words and syntax. This is, by the way, the first sentence from a well-known book on globalization by Oosterhammel and Peterson. And I must admit that I mistranslated it myself in a translation course I had 4 years ago until I realized its constructional nature. So the sentence reads quite simply, Globalisierung ist ein Begriff der Gegenwartsdiagnose, and this has been wrongly translated as globalization is a term often used to explain today's world in the published translation. An adequate rendition of this sentence is far from easy and calls for a few remarks. To begin with, the translator needs to consider both the macro context. This is a book about globalization written from the perspective of two historians. The book also takes account of interdisciplinary aspects, and the micro context. This is an introductory sentence which in English texts of the same ilk is usually short and easy to understand. Secondly, research on Gegenwartsdiagnose reveals two things. First, the word is used mainly in German sociology, and second, its meaning can be defined as follows. Sie stellen Lesarten, that is the Gegenwartsdiagnose, stellen Lesarten des Heute und Morgen dar und konkurrieren diesbezüglich, wie bereits eingangs angesprochen, mit anderen Sozialwissenschaften ebenso wie mit journalistischen Reflexionen oder politischen Programmschriften. Soziologische Gegenwartsdiagnosen tragen also im Konzert mit solchen anderen Deutungsangeboten dazu bei, dass die gesellschaftliche Selbstverständigung darüber, wo wir mittlerweile angekommen sind und wohin es mit uns noch führen kann, nicht abreißt. So that is an explanation of Gegenwartsdiagnose by a sociologist. Thirdly, the Duden offers no definition of diagnose that comes close to its sociological use. The only English dictionary to provide a suitable definition that is congruent with the German sense is the American Heritage Dictionary, which defines diagnosis as follows: a thorough analysis of facts or problems in order to gain understanding and aid future planning. An opinion or conclusion reached through such an analysis. What is problematic here is the addition of aid future planning, since German Gegenwartsdiagnose is about interpretation rather than action. The practice of diagnosing the present simply hasn't been terminologized in English. So we need to resort to paraphrases based on the work of Anglophone researchers with similar interests, such as Anthony Giddens or James Coleman, who deal with what they call modernity. A synonym of modernity is contemporary history, and these terms should therefore be preferred to present. Preferred word combinations in English language sociology or historiography are analysis of modernity, or more rarely diagnosis of modernity, characterize modernity, or describe modernity. More precise renditions suitable for other contexts might be explicate modernity or interpret contemporary history. The fourth and last problem to be solved takes us back to the level of construction proper. What does the construction X ist ein Begriff der des plus Genitiv plus genitive noun mean? Does the term simply occur in analyses of modernity, or is it a key notion used to explicate modernity? Let's look at the following examples. Einheit ist ein Begriff der Wissenschaftstheorie. Begriffserläuterung und begriffsgeschichtliche Verortung, this is a heading. Sozialstaat ist ein Begriff der politischen, der verfassungsrechtlichen und der sozialwissenschaftlichen Sprache der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Volkskirche ist ein Begriff der kirchlichen Zeitgeschichte. Approbation ist ein Begriff des deutschen Verwaltungsrechts. These prototypical uses, example of which could easily be multiplied, prove beyond doubt that the construction something ist ein Begriff plus genitive is used to assign a term to a category or field, and this interpretation is confirmed by the heading which precedes the second citation, Begriffserläuterung und begriffsgeschichtliche Verortung. Plainly, the translator's sensitivity to constructional meaning, her German Sprachgefühl, is being tested to the limit here and is not up to the mark. And mine wasn't either in 2016, but we'll live and learn. So the first sentence of the book serves to situate the term within a particular research tradition. Now we have to ask ourselves, how is this normally done in English? Let's look at a few examples again. Determinism is a term that belongs to the vocabulary of moral theology. It is a term that belongs to the discourse of victims. Stochastic resonance is a term from science, while dithering is a term from engineering. This is a term from analysis of variance. Now, since Gegenwartsdiagnose is a scholarly undertaking, it would seem necessary to add this meaning component to our translation, so that the translation I'd suggest is globalization is a term used in the scholarly analysis of modernity. Now we can't be more explicit than that in a first sentence. A wording like a term used by German sociologists in the analysis of modernity I think would be likely to put off potential English-speaking readers as an introductory sentence.
Having talked about constructions, it's important to realise that some constructions are almost entirely syntactic in nature, and this is what we're going to turn to now. We're going to look at the positioning of adverbials. There are two general regularities to be observed here. The first is that the relative order, especially of sentence adjuncts, can be changed to suit the demands of information focus. We'll see a few examples in a minute. The second point is that shorter adjuncts tend to precede longer ones, and in practice this often means that adverbs precede noun phrases, which precede prepositional phrases, which precede non-finite clauses, which precede finite clauses. Interestingly, these general principles lead to diametrically opposed sequencing of adjuncts in English and German. As we can see from the following example that was invented by Quirk and others. John was working on his hobby with the new shears in the rose garden for the whole of his day off to complete the season's pruning. In German, this corresponds to, den diesjährigen Grünschnitt fertigzustellen, arbeitete John seinen ganzen freien Tag lang im Rosengarten mit der neuen Schere an seinem hobby. So what we see here is that English places obligatory complements before optional supplements, while the reverse order is seen in German. Quirk and his colleagues claim that in clause initial position, adjuncts usually appear in the following order: place time or process time. However, there's some contradictory evidence to be found in academic text, and translators working from German into English can model their solutions on the varied patterns observed. So, for instance, we get respect place time. For example, in the Maremu baboon population, after a new male immigrates into the group and achieves top rank, he often kills unweaned infants. Time respect. In the mid-14th century, with Petrarch, an awareness arose in Italian humanist circles, not only of blah blah blah. Time respect. In the next 11 years, as Bavarian Minister of War and Police, he reorganized the army. And time respect, another example. In recent years, as part of a comprehensive program review, the Census Bureau sponsored blah blah blah. A common problem in German-English translation is that the freedom enjoyed by German adverbials allows a larger number of them to be packed into one sentence than is the case in English. The resultant surfeit of adverbials may be quite bothersome to the translator. Here are a few translation specimens for which we will make a comparison with DeepL. What is both striking and reassuring here is the utter inability of the computer to render German sentences loaded with adverbials in accordance with the spirit of the English language. It can't be denied, of course, that human translators also struggle with such sentences since they require complex rearrangements of their information content. To make such changes, the translator needs to be in full command of the positional possibilities offered by English, and which we've just talked about. And the translator also needs to remember that English requires more verbs, and hence elements dependent on verbs. Take these two examples where experienced human translators would tend to introduce additional verbs, and DeepL and less experienced human translators slavishly imitate the German syntax using just one verb. Nach Hitlers Ernennung zum Reichskanzler hatte Polens starker Mann, Marschall Piłsudski, mit großer Wahrscheinlichkeit im April 1933, möglicherweise auch schon im März, über streng vertrauliche Kanäle sondieren lassen. Sondieren ist the verb. Ob Frankreich sich an einer eventuellen Präventivaktion nach Art der Ruhrbesetzung von 1923 beteiligen will. So the verb sondieren is surrounded by a number of adverbials and also a dependent subclause that is introduced by op, an indirect interrogative clause. When Hitler became Chancellor, this is the human translation, Poland's strongman Józef Piłsudski had taken soundings via strictly confidential channels that were almost certainly opened up in April 1933, and possibly even the previous month, His aim being to establish whether France would join in a preventive plan and so on. So what we can see here is that the human translator has opted for at least one additional verb and has rephrased the indirect interrogative clause. DeepL just uses one verb, and well, this doesn't lead to an acceptable English sentence. After Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor, Poland's strongman Marshal Pilsudski had in all probability in April 1933, possibly even as early as March, sounded out through strictly confidential channels whether France would participate in a possible preventive action. A similar example is provided by this sentence. Oslos Devisenreserven dürften durch Flucht aus der Krone seit der Stockholmer Entscheidung etwa die Hälfte geschrumpft sein. The translation produced by John Desmond Gallagher in an unpublished manuscript reads as follows. Since the Swedish government's decision, speculators have piled out of the corner, with the result that Norway has now probably lost about 50% of its foreign currency reserves. DeepL comes up with the following impossible solution. Oslo's foreign exchange reserves have probably shrunk by about half since the Stockholm decision due to the flight from the krona. So here's a summary of what to do about a superabundance of adverbials in the form of a skill box, which I use liberally in my book on academic translation. Try to place, that's the first point, try to place the English equivalents of German adjuncts in their natural positions in the English clause. You'll almost certainly have to change their ordering, and you'll sometimes need to introduce additional linking words. If your English sentence still sounds awkward, go on to 2. 2. Redistribute the information contained in the German sentence across several English clauses or sentences. You will need to introduce additional verbs. So I'll leave you with just 3 take-home points. First point, general language and general academic words are deceptively simple. Standard lexical equations you may have learned just won't do when translating academic texts. Second point, often a detailed lexicosemantic analysis is necessary, which also takes account of underlying constructions, as we saw with the text on globalization. And third point, German academic syntax often requires complex rearrangements in English. Sentence-by-sentence translation is not always possible. Obviously, I've only really been able to scrape the surface of what is a vast area, and much more could be said about it. If you want to delve a little deeper, my talk has been based on this new book of mine, out in November. Thanks for listening.